When editing images, I typically group them into two separate categories. The first one is the one that I can edit directly in Lightroom without ever leaving Lightroom. And then the second one is the one that requires a bit more post-processing. And those are the images that will carry into Photoshop. Now, if I want the ultimate image quality and if I want to get the best out of each image that I edit, I typically end up in Photoshop anyway, but most of the time I try not to, simply because of time savings. Because as soon as you take an image into Photoshop, it can take a lot longer time, sometimes even hours, to get the look that you want. So that's something to keep in mind. If you want to take your images to the next level and you want to experiment with Photoshop, especially if you're new to Photoshop, it might take you a while to be able to understand how all the tools within that software work. So for this particular case study, what I want to do is start with an image in Lightroom, do some editing in there, and then take it into Photoshop for further post-processing. So let's just jump right into it. Right here, I've got some images from Jordan, and I selected one image, which I think it's a pretty good candidate because there are a few issues here which would make me want to take it into Photoshop. First of all, the image does require some editing. There are a few areas that I want to highlight, which I will be able to use techniques like dodging and burning to be able to bring out some detail for the viewer to look at. And then I have also some problems in this image, particularly if you look closely here. I've got an image of a car, I've got these tracks of cars, and these tracks come and go. So it's not a permanent feature of this landscape. And then there are other things such as bird poops and other problems in this image which I want to address. So first I'll start in Lightroom, make some edits, and we'll just go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the develop module by pressing D, and as of now, there are no changes made to the image. So what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to start with camera calibration, and I think I'm going to start with camera standard this time, simply because that's typically something that works really well for Nikon images. And I'm not going to worry about all these other settings, so camera standard is a pretty good one to go with here. Again, I'm going to adjust the saturation in the blue primary channel simply because I've got some blues in here and I want the overall look to be a little bit more adjusted just through that slider. So let's just set something like +30. And again, experiment with this, see what works for you, but right around 25-30 is going to work pretty well for this particular image. So let's move up a little bit. I'm not going to worry about vignetting or transforming anything in this image. I definitely do want to check the remove chromatic aberration because I'm sure there's going to be some areas in here that contain that. And then let's see what happens if I enable the profile corrections. So if I do that, well, it was actually adjusted to Tamron SP1530, but are the changes worth keeping is the question I want to ask. So looks like the distortion got corrected fairly well, but I'm not sure about the vignetting settings. So I'm going to go ahead and tone that down a little bit. I think that was a little bit too much. All right, so from here, we're going to move up and we're looking at sharpening and all these other settings, but I actually want to come down here a little bit later. The first thing I want to do is jump back to the basic submodule, and there are a few areas in the image that I want to take care of. Specifically, this top area of the image is where the color is. And I know while I was there that there was some color in the sky. And I really love the image for that reason because there's sun bursting through the clouds. There's all these rays coming out of it, and then all that color is actually reflecting off that rock. Now, you can't see it in this raw image because it's just bland. It's really, there's nothing that we've done to the image yet. So let's go ahead and try to bring that out. I'm going to play with the white balance first. So auto white balance obviously warms it up a lot, and I don't think I like that. I actually want to tone it back just a little bit more. So S shot is a little bit too blue. So let's try to just push it a little bit more towards the right side, and maybe right around 5200 or so is going to be a good setting. So let's just keep it right there. And tint I'm not going to worry about here. So that looks pretty decent already with the white balance. So the next thing I'm going to do is go through all these sliders, and I'm not going to spend too much time explaining what they do because I've already done that. So let's just work with this stuff a little bit. So the idea here is to try to recover a lot of the details in this top portion of the frame, which I know I'm going to be able to achieve through highlights and exposure. So let's first start with highlights. I want to bring it down, and then as you can see, as I bring it back down, now we see a bunch of color right here in this region, which is kind of nice. So maybe a -100 is going to work pretty well. I don't think I need to worry about the exposure too much, but let's just see what happens if I tone it down. As I tone it down, you can see I don't really recover much. I know that I'm losing the detail here, but I really don't need that detail because that's actually where the sun is, so it is going to be bright. I'm just going to bring this back to 0. The next thing I'm going to do is the shadow area right here is a little bit too dark for my taste. So let's go ahead and bring that up a little bit. So maybe right around +40 or so, +35. And then the next thing is, as before, I'm going to try to push the whites a little bit. And it looks like actually I was not blowing out on that sun, which is pretty incredible. And I'm going to bring the blacks down just a little bit. So that gives us a bit of a contrast. So if we go back and forth, that's actually pretty decent, and looks like I have not overexposed anything in the sky, so I'm pretty happy with these settings. All right, so let's do a little bit of clarity. Maybe if I push it too much, that's obviously going to be too much. So again, I try to stay in the +20 is the max I would ever go. Maybe +15 for this image is going to be okay. And the vibrance and saturation, I never again touch the saturation, but vibrance, let's push it out just a little more. And as you can see, if I go too much, the entire background is becoming blue, and that's not going to work for me. So let's just tone it down to maybe just +15 or so. All right, so we recovered some more blues in the sky, and the image is now looking decent. At this point, what I want to do though is I'm looking at this area right here, and perhaps we can recover a little bit more. With the highlights pushed to all the way to -100, one of the ways that I can actually work on that is if I select the highlights and start bringing this down. As you can see on the top portion of the frame, it's actually impacting that quite a bit. And if I push it all the way, that is a bit too much. So what I want to do is maybe bring down just a little bit, but not enough to get rid of those whites, which the whites in the clouds right there are looking actually pretty good. So maybe right around -24 or so. So if we go back and forward, as you can see, it actually toned it down just a little bit more, and we should be able to recover a lot more color in this region a little bit later on. So I'm just going to keep it right there, and the next thing is there are plenty of other issues in the image, and I can see plenty of haze in the mountains in the back there, which I do want to work on. And then there's also quite a bit of work here in the foreground that I want to work on. But I don't think I want to do any of that in Lightroom anymore, simply because there's really not much stuff to play with here in terms of settings. Now, coming to split toning though, maybe there are a couple of things that I can try, and specifically in the highlights area right here. So let's see what we can do here. I'm going to go ahead and boost the saturation up just a bit, and then let's see if we can just move it to the yellow area. Just maybe right around here, and see how much we can actually boost it up in terms of colors. So if I start moving it, as you can see, that's actually impacting the blues in the sky, and I don't like that. So we need to be very, very careful as we apply the split toning. So maybe right around +17 or so if we turn it off and turn it back on. As you can see, it's a subtle change, but you can see a lot more yellows here on the top region, which is actually not bad. So I'm going to keep it right around that level there. So from here, let's move down to the detail. And this is something that if I'm going to take it to Photoshop, I am going to work on the slider, simply because I want to perform some sharpening and then take sharpening to Photoshop and perform an additional layer of sharpening. And I'll show you how that works. So in this case, what I'm going to do, push the detail all the way to 100, bring radius down, and the sharpening is something that you have to be very careful about, because you want to apply just enough to be able to have a little bit of details, but not enough to be able to actually have sharpening seen in the image, because the moment that becomes very strong, I'm going to have very limited options in Photoshop. So let's go ahead and just apply maybe at most 20, but I'm going to start from 0 and push it just a little more. So maybe right around 18 or 20 is going to be enough. Looking at this, that actually brought up just enough of details for me to be able to work with this. So that should be pretty good. So I don't think there's really much else that I want to do in Lightroom. So let's go ahead and take this image into Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, edit in Adobe Photoshop. And what this will do, it will launch Photoshop. And now that Photoshop is open, I'm going to go ahead and maximize the window, and I'm going to switch the workspace to photography because that's the first thing I do for a number of reasons, but one of them is that I see the histogram and only the tools that I really need. So there are a few things that I want to do here, and let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is that I want to actually start editing the image non-destructively, which is maybe something that sounds confusing for the reason that we earlier defined Photoshop as destructive software. But what I mean as non-destructive in Photoshop in particular is that I want to make my edits and stack them on top of each other so that if I actually make edits, I don't have to go back and re-roll everything. And if one of my layers, for example, has an effect that I don't like, that way I don't have to start over. So a lot of people that start in Photoshop usually end up making edits either in the background, or they create one layer and they make all the changes to that one single layer. But my personal preference is to actually create multiple layers. And even for things like cloning, I usually do that. So for example, in here, what I'm going to do is double click this and create a brand new layer out of that one. So that's my first layer. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer that has nothing on it. As you can see, it's just a layer on its own. So I can rename this one. So in fact, let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to call this background as our initial layer. And this is the one that I intend not to touch. Everything else I want to try to build on top of it. So for this one first, as I said earlier, my goal is to try to clean up the image as much as possible. And there are a few things in here that I want to clean up. And what we'll do is any changes that I make to the image right now are going to be carried over to this layer 1. And specifically, I want to start with a spot healing tool. So in this case, I'm going to just use this first one, and then I'm going to set the mode to replace. What that will do is it will actually try to copy an area next to it instead of trying to blend it. And I usually use replace, but every once in a while I'll switch to normal. It really depends on what I do. So I'm gonna set this to content aware with a small brush size, and I want to get rid of this bird poop and a few other marks in here in the image. So on the top of this layer, the way we do that is you also need to make sure that you check sample all layers, because if you don't do that, watch what happens. If I try to apply that, well, nothing happens because it's now on top of this layer and it doesn't see the layer underneath that. So what I'm gonna do is check that, and now if I apply that change, that is now taking care of all those issues, and just with a few brush strokes, which I can use a mouse or a touchpad, but I really prefer this tool because it's really easy to use, especially for things like dodging and burning. So let's go ahead and clean up all this stuff in here. And again, you can take it as much as you want in terms of how much of this you want to edit. And I'm just going to remove the things that look annoying to me. I'm going to zoom in a little more to this car right here. This is the car that we actually drove on to get to this spot, and I'm going to go ahead and remove all these tracks right here as well. So just increase the size of the brush and just start painting all these areas out. And as you can see, it's doing a pretty decent job by removing all those tracks. So let's go ahead and do that. And it's pretty random here, so it should work out pretty well. All right, I think that looks pretty clean. So other things that I want to take care of are other spots on these rocks, maybe just a little bit of these white areas right here. Just take care of those just so that they don't look distracting. And that right there looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and zoom out, and that's what we got so far. As you can see, it actually did a pretty decent job. Now here's an interesting thing. If I go ahead and hide the background layer, this is all that you see on this top layer, and these are applying on both. So as you can see, these are just adjustments on top of this background layer, and they look pretty good because if I turn this off, you can see all those car tracks in the background. So this does a really good job here. And if I wanted to, I could actually work furthermore in removing all those lines and cleaning it further. But in this particular case, I think it's not as distracting as it was before. Now, the benefit of doing it this way with a layer on top of another layer where I'm applying these changes like spot healing is that if I wanted to go back and say, you know what, maybe I didn't like that spot healing, I can actually just turn on this layer right here and just erase some of these things that I've done to the image, and it will just roll back. Whereas if I apply it directly on the image, then I have to roll back by going and undoing the changes that I made to the image. So that's something very important to keep in mind. Sometimes you mess up and you don't know that you messed up until you see it later. For that reason alone, I recommend doing it on a separate layer. So let's just call this layer spot healing, just so that we can identify it later. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer, and this one is going to be specifically for dodging and burning. And this one is also going to work very similarly as the spot healing layer, because the idea is to make it non-destructive, because whatever I do is going to be just stacking on top of each other. So what I'm going to do, instead of using the dodge and burn tools here, which again are going to apply specifically to that layer, I'm going to create a brand new layer right here. And one of the things that I can do here is, instead of just clicking on the layer, if I hold on the Alt key on the keyboard and click on it, it brings up this window instead of just creating a new one. And I can give it a name, so I'll just call it Dodge and Burn. And as soon as I come down here and click Overlay, it's going to allow me to pick this option right here, which says fill with overlay neutral color 50% gray. Now with that option, as I showed you before, you're going to see a transparent layer, which you can then use the brush for, and by adjusting the brush to either white or black, you can start your dodging and burning. So in this case, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and now I have a brand new dodge and burn layer. And as you can see, if I turn it on or off, nothing happens to the image because it's 50% gray and the mode is set to overlay. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and select the brush tool, and now I need to decide on what I'm going to dodge and burn. And remember, dodging is highlighting the areas that you want the person to look at, and burning means darkening some of the areas. So by doing this technique, you can actually bring out some things and maybe tone down other things. In this particular case, I think I already know what I want. I want this rock right here in the foreground to look a little bit brighter, while these rocks in the background, they have quite a bit of haze, which I'm going to try to reduce, and at the same time I want to make them appear less bright. And dodge and burn is going to work for that beautifully. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on this button right here, which means that it's going to apply pressure sensitivity for opacity, and then the second one is going to be applying pressure sensitivity for size. So let me demonstrate what that looks like. If I change it to black, and I'm going to change the opacity to 100%, which is obviously quite a lot, but you can see the effect right here. As I start moving it and I'm applying a little pressure, it's doing a little, and if I apply a lot of pressure and start moving it, see how big of a change that is? That allows me to use this tool in a number of ways. By applying a little pressure and just brushing and stroking in some areas, what I can do is very subtly apply the dodging or burning depending on the type of the brush that I choose. So in this particular case, I chose the black brush, which is doing that specifically, darkening the areas. And if I switch to the white brush right here, by clicking here, as you can see, it's painting it white. So let's go ahead and undo both. So Command Alt Z is going to step backward, and obviously opacity at 100% is way too much. I usually start just at maybe something like 5. So at this point, let's go ahead and paint some of these areas on these rocks. And I'm going to start from the top right here. Now I have to be very careful, because if I go over, it will start painting the background as well, which will create kind of a weird looking halo. And that's something that I do not want. So I'm going to start kind of at a finer area right here, just zoom in a little bit, and then just start applying that brush stroke right here towards the edges first. I gotta be careful, because I do not want to be painting too much in the shadow area, because that then will make the shadows appear much brighter than they should be. Remember, the sun is coming from this side and it's hitting the rock on this side, and I want to be very careful about how I do it. So let's go ahead and apply more to this area. I'm just applying some brush strokes, just a little bit here. And it's a kind of a big area to paint over, so I gotta probably go back and just review what I've been doing here just to make sure that I'm covering enough of the areas and I don't have some weird spots in the image. All right, so let's take a look at what we've done so far. If I go ahead and turn that layer on and off, you can see it's a subtle change, but it's definitely there. And I actually like it. You know, it's brightened up some of these areas, which is nice. Now, this top hasn't really seen all that much, and I do want to brighten up just a little bit. So I'm going to reduce the size of the brush and just focus on these areas right here. Now, remember, all of the stuff that I'm working on is being applied on top of the changes that I made already. So these are just additional steps. And as you can see, there's a little bit of white in here in that layer that's already visible. And if I go ahead and turn these layers off, you can see, let me zoom out, these are all the things that I've done to the image. And it's not bad. I mean, if we turn these back on, that area is now looking much brighter and it's not too bad. All right, so that's our dodge layer. And I don't think there's anything else in here that I want to highlight. So I'm gonna zoom out, and now I want to focus a little bit more on those mountains and just burn them a little bit, and maybe even this background right here in that area. Let's see if we can do that. All I have to do is either press X, which switches the brush from white to black, or I can just click right here, which does exactly the same thing. So let's go ahead and zoom in. And I'm going to start working around these background mountains. So let's go ahead and select that. And for these, in fact, I might want to increase that opacity from that 5% to something a little bit more, just because I might want to actually darken this a little bit more. So let's go ahead and jump to something like 8%. All right, now let's go ahead and zoom out and take a look at the before and after. And that's a pretty drastic change. As you can see, we're actually able to recover a lot of that and get rid of a lot of that haze in the distance just by using the burn tool here, which is actually not bad. You know, I really like the way that it worked out. And I'm gonna reduce this opacity to something like 3% and just paint some of these areas out because I want them to be looking just a little darker. So I'm just gonna switch to a big brush and just apply gentle strokes right in these areas here. All right, just reduce it a little bit, go around here, increase the size a little bit. And remember, I am doing this with pressure sensitivity, so as I pick a different brush size, I'm still controlling how much pressure I'm applying. So if I apply little pressure, it's less opacity and less size. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look at what we've got here. So this is what I've done to the layer. And as you can see, I darkened a little bit of the background here, maybe overdone it a little bit here, but it's okay because that's the beauty of using this particular technique in a different layer. If I don't like anything, I can always zoom in to those areas and either completely repaint them in gray. So if I said this is a bit too much, I can just pick the gray and just paint over. I want to make sure that the opacity set to 100, and let's just paint that over because that was a bit too much right there, too much right here. And that's kind of a nice thing. As you can see, I can just apply these changes without really doing the damage to the underlying layer here. And that's kind of the nice thing. So I think that looks pretty nice. And once again, the before and after, a pretty huge change. All right, so what else can we do here? Now, if I did not make significant changes in Lightroom, I could use additional tools within Photoshop to make adjustments to the image. For example, things like tone curve. Under the adjustments tab right here, if I click on that curves, I can actually modify this curve to be, say, an S curve, just a very slight, subtle change there. Well, if I were to do that, as you can see, it just created a brand new layer, and that stacks on top of everything else. And the beauty of this is that I can actually come back to this particular layer and modify it at any time. But in this particular case, as you can see, it actually did change the sky. And if I turn this on, it's actually making it a little bit brighter, which I'm not sure I like at this point, because I am going to apply some changes to the image, pretty significant changes in the next step. And that's going to be when I use some of the filters. So let's go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to go ahead and just delete that layer and get rid of that. Now the next step is going to involve some pretty significant changes to the image, because so far we've done dodge and burn, spot healing to the image, just very subtle changes. But I'm going to now launch Nik Software. I'm going to go to Filter, Nik Collection, and there are going to be a bunch of different tools in here if you install the whole suite. And the tools that I personally use a lot are going to be Color Effects, Define. Sometimes I use Sharpener Pro, and I also use Viveza 2 quite a bit. Now, if you like black and white, Silver Efex Pro 2 can also be really good. But in this particular case, what I want to do is I actually want to start by boosting the contrast of this image. And I can achieve that by just going into Color Effects and launching that. And as soon as it comes up, you see this really strange situation. Well, everything that we saw before is kind of gone, and now it's actually trying to work off of my dodge and burn layer. And this is something that's going to happen simply because I selected that top layer. I'm going to go ahead and click cancel. And this is something that I want to explain real quick here. When you work with Nik Software, first of all, you want to select a layer that is a composite layer that contains all of the changes that you made so far to the image. If you don't do that and you select a layer like dodge and burn or spot healing, it's going to try to make changes to that particular layer. Now, this presents a problem because so far all the changes that I made to the image are non-destructive, which means I can delete that layer, start over, or make changes to the existing layer, and I'm still good. So if you find yourself making changes to the image through filters, and then all of a sudden you want to go back because maybe the change that you made is something that you don't like, unfortunately, it's not something that you will be able to easily undo. It's going to create a brand new layer and apply it on top of everything else that you've done so far. So this is something to keep in mind, is that once you use one of these filters, it's going to become a composite layer that's going to contain everything that you have underneath, provided that you're going to make a composite layer. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we make it so that it selects all three layers into a single one, and then we can use that in Google Nik? So you're going to have to hold Command Alt Shift E, and that just created a composite layer. So if we go ahead and turn all of these off, as you can see, nothing changes because that has just put all of these three layers together. And if I check these back on, nothing happens. Remember, this layer is now the master layer. It's sitting on top of all of the others, and anything that I do from this point on, unfortunately, becomes destructive. If I now need to roll back at any point of time from this point on, I'm gonna have to delete everything that I've done from the top and start over. So that's just something to keep in mind. So at this point, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to go ahead and rename this and call it Composite, although I really don't need to do that because that composite layer is gonna be gone in a second. You'll see why. If I go to Filter now, and go to Nik Collection, Color Efex Pro. Now, as you can see, the whole image appeared, and that's a good thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and maximize color effects, and there are a bunch of different tools. I'm not gonna go through any of these because there's just too much to cover, but I'm gonna start with Pro Contrast because that's exactly what I wanna do to this image. Now, this is a really good tool for a situation like this because it allows you to add more contrast to the image very quickly and selectively do some adjustments. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with dynamic contrast, and as I push it to the right, you can see how much of a change is being carried out. If I go all the way to 100, that's a pretty drastic change, but you can see how much of this area became brighter, and while the background is also getting a lot more contrast. So I'm gonna have to tone that down, start from 0, and just increase it enough right around 40. Next, we're going to work on this correct contrast slider. And as I move it, as you can see, it's adding a bit more boost. So if I go all the way to the end, that's a very, very contrasty image. And as you can see, it blew out all the highlights, and that's not looking good. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is that underneath here, I've got loop and histogram. And if I actually click on that, that can be a very useful tool to look at, specifically the histogram, because I can clearly see that I'm blowing out a lot of data. If I move here, you can see it even shows me all the areas that are blown out. So I use that all the time, and I actually start from here, and as you can see, we have nothing that's blown out. And as you increase it, you're gonna see a boost, and the more the boost, the more the things are going to blow out. And at this point, I'm actually blowing out quite a bit in this area right here, because what I'm doing is I'm adding so much more yellow that it's now becoming way too saturated. So that's a really cool thing to look at. And I'm just going to make a very subtle change, maybe somewhere around 25. Now the last one is correct color cast, and this is for situations where the color has been changed as a result of the contrast change, and you can actually move this, and as you can see, if I move it to the right, it becomes more blue, and all the way to the left is where I had it. So if you find that the change that you've made is impacting the colors and moving them to the orange side, now you can move that and correct to bring it back to blue. So I think in this case, it's actually looking pretty nice. And if I actually push it a little bit, maybe around 20, I'm regaining some of that blue here in the sky, which is looking quite nice. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that as you make these changes, you might notice that there is another slider right here, highlights, which you can also use. And if you find yourself boosting these values a bit too much, you can actually use the highlight slider and bring it back to the right side. And as you do that, as you can see, it actually recovered a lot of it. So if you do want more color, and in this case, if I say push it right around 40, the histogram is showing that I'm blowing that area out. But if I start pushing the highlights, I can actually tone that down quite a bit. So it really depends on what type of image you're working with. Just experiment with these here. And just like highlights, you also have shadows. So if you want to make additional changes to it, you can work with these sliders. But I think, in fact, with this change of the correct contrast and then applying a little bit of the highlight recovery, it's actually looking pretty decent. Now, if I go ahead and uncheck this, we can see the before and after. And as you can see, that's a very big change. This is where we started, and this is where we're at. Now, one thing that I don't like is if you look at this area right here, I'm actually brightening it way too much. So I'm going to try to see if I can recover a little bit more of that by pushing the highlights, but unfortunately I can't because it's not really blown out. It's a bit too aggressive. So I'm going to tone this down and actually bring this back a little bit, maybe right around 30. So let's take a look at the before and after, and that looks a little bit better. So that's not too bad. And considering how much we've done, which is just 3 sliders and a little bit of the highlight recovery, we actually improved the look of the image significantly. And this is kind of the nice thing about using a third-party plugin. You can make these changes and you don't have to go through all these different adjustments and color channels. There's so many ways to do things in Photoshop, and I'm sure you can achieve a very similar look by playing with all these different tools in Photoshop, but just with 3 sliders I was able to drastically change the appearance of the image and make it instantly pop. Now, another thing that is really nice is that within color effects there is also the ability to stack these different effects. So I have Pro Contrast right now, but if I clicked on Add Filter, I have the ability to stack another filter on top of this one. And we can take a look at things like polarization, for example, and I don't know how well it's going to work for this image, but if I'm going to start from 0 strength, and this is going to kind of try to simulate the effect of a polarizer, if I start taking the strength all the way to the right, as you can see, it's making the blues way bluer, and then it's also adding a lot more to this area here. So just going back to 0 and starting over, maybe just a little bit of that, but you got to be very careful because at this point the sky is blue enough. If I'm going to oversaturate it, it's going to look really fake. So that's perhaps something that you may not want to do in an image like this. So let's go ahead and turn that on and off and see what kind of change we've got. And you know what? It's actually not too bad. I think I'm gonna keep that at a very low value of around 25, 26. So that's the nice thing about color effects, is that there are so many different tools that you can stack on top of each other. And if I wanted to add another one, I can click on add filter and add another one and play with it as much as I want. But I'll be honest with you, most of these I rarely ever touch. The ones that I normally use is brilliance and warmth. If I wanted to instantly give it a pop, that's another one that I'll use. So I'm gonna go ahead and just mark these with stars. So brilliance and warmth. Another one that I use is Pro Contrast that I show you. And then the polarization one is not bad either. And every once in a while, the tonal contrast. This one can be a bit too aggressive, but these are the primary ones that I use. Once you select your favorite, you can just click the favorites and then you don't see all that junk on the left side. So let me just demonstrate one more. I'm gonna add a filter and add the brilliance and warmth. And for this one, I'm not gonna use it for this image, but if you had an image that you wanted to warm up very quickly or just add a bit more saturation, this is where you do it from. So usually I don't go beyond 10 on each saturation and warmth, but let's just see what happens. If I start pushing this, as you can see, it's a very similar slider as the saturation slider that you find in Lightroom. So you got to be very, very careful about how you make adjustments. Like I said, I normally don't ever go beyond 10. Now warmth is, if I go to the left side, it makes the image bluer. And then if I go to the right side, it makes the image more orange. So in this case, I do not want to touch either one because I think there's plenty of both. But just for the comparison's sake, let's just try something like 10 in saturation. And if I turn this on and off, you can see that was a very subtle change, a little bit more of the yellow boost here. And in fact, you know what? I'm just gonna keep it here. If I wanted to go back and make changes to them, I can do that. Or if I wanted to get rid of one of these, I can just click the X right here and we'll get rid of it. So I think that's pretty good right here. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now that it's done, we have a brand new layer called Color Effects Pro. Now remember, I told you before there was really no use for this composite layer because it used that layer, made all the adjustments, and pushed all of those into a single layer. So I can actually, if I undo that, I can come back here and get rid of this completely. It really does nothing at this point. And this now becomes the master layer that's sitting on top of these all other layers. And from this point on, if I make any changes that I'm not satisfied with, unfortunately, there's not an easy rollback. Because if I say, go back and adjust my spot healing, I can't just go back here and make changes to the spot healing layer or the dodge and burn layer, because none of that is going to be visible due to this layer sitting on top of it and containing all of that composite information in that single layer. So just keep that in mind. But I'm going to keep this as the layer, nevertheless, even with the changes that I work going forward, because then I can roll back a few steps, undo the things that I want to do, and start over. So I'm not going to bother with changing the layer name here. And let's just take a quick look at the before and after. This is just one filter doing all of that work for me. And as you can see, there's a lot more pop, a lot more contrast and saturation added everywhere. Now you might be thinking that these adjustments are way too aggressive and maybe that's not something that you want to do to the image. And remember, the nice thing about Photoshop is that with each layer, you have the ability to tone down on the opacity. So if I said that's a lot of contrast and I want to tone it down, I have the ability to do so. So I can just start with nothing and just increase that until I get to the point where I think it's looking nice. Now, what other things can we do to the image to make it look even better? At this point, I've got the beautiful sky. I've got the rock here that I highlighted earlier with dodge and burn, and then the background is looking nice. One thing that I might want to do is there is a bit of blue in the background, which is perfectly fine for a lot of the images because when you have haze, the background should have some blue. I don't have any intention to completely eliminate it, but to be honest, it looks a bit too blue here on the left side, and it's looking a bit too blue on the right side. So let's try and reduce that. Now, for this one, I'm going to use another favorite tool of mine called Viveza. So let's go ahead and go to Filter, Nik Collection again, and I'm going to launch Viveza 2. Now, when this one comes up, I'm going to go ahead and maximize it. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is, this is obviously working off of that last layer. I'm going to pick an area that I want to reduce that haze on, and in this case, I'm going to use this. And by clicking the add control point, you can add as many control points as you want. And here, all I want to do is reduce this to a smaller area, and here in particular. And what I'll do here is adjust some of these so that I can remove maybe some of that blue and maybe even darken the background just a tad. So I've got a bunch of different sliders which I can control through here, or I can move over here, dial them manually, or move the slider on the right side as well. Now the one that I'm going to use is the blue one. So if I take this blue slider and start moving it to the left side, as you can see, it's reducing that blue in that area pretty significantly, and just dialing right around 28%, I was able to get rid of quite a bit of blue. If I push it all the way to the left side, now it's not looking good because it removed the blue and added a bunch of other color, which is not something I want. So I want to be very careful with this particular slider. So let's keep it right around maybe 25, maybe just a little bit more, right around 35. So let's take a look at the before and after. And for this one, I have to click on the preview and check and uncheck. And as you can see, that's a lot of blue removed from that mountain range. And the nice thing is it's not really impacting anything else because I applied it just to this area. And what I can do from here, I can just duplicate that and I can start moving it, and I can bring it over here to the right side. And I know there's quite a bit of blue, but I reduce the size that it's impacting, and I actually see quite a bit of not just blue, but also some red, which might not be something I want to keep at that level. So maybe just reduce a little bit of reds there. Just a very subtle change. Now, this is already looking quite nice, and if I wanted to reduce the haze even further more here, what I could do is I could drop another one right here and say I'm going to increase the contrast. And if I start moving the contrast slider to the right side, as you can see, it's actually removing the haze, but it's also impacting that area pretty significantly. And this is the before and after. This is something that you might want to be a bit careful about. So again, contrast is not something that is always going to give you the best results for that reason. But another thing I can do is maybe reduce the brightness just a little bit to -8. And let's take a look. That's before and that's after. And as you can see, the haze is reduced significantly in that area, which is something that I actually want to keep. So let's go ahead and move this a little bit to the left side. I'm going to reduce the size a little bit, duplicate that one, move it over to the right, and right around here is where we drop the second one, duplicate that over, move it over to the right side, maybe reduce the size a little bit so that none of this other area is touched. Duplicate. And again, the nice thing here is that as I'm doing this, as you can see, it's not actually touching the sky. It's not touching anything else. It's just affecting the color range that I'm picking and just making those adjustments there. So at this point, I literally created one, made adjustments, and then copied them over to the right side. Let's take a look at the before and after. So that's before and that's after. And that's a huge change just in the contrast of the background. I was able to reduce a lot of the haze just by using this tool. Really, really nice. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and click OK. Now there's one thing that I want to do here, which is now that I have another layer that's sitting as a composite layer on top of everything else, we really have no use for this Color Effects Pro 4. So I really don't need this anymore because whenever I launched Viveza 2, it went on top of that previous layer. In this case, all I can do is just get rid of it, and I'll explain why. Well, first of all, if you have more layers, the file size is going to increase dramatically, and that's something that you might not want to do, because if I kept that layer, it was sitting on the bottom of the Viveza layer and it's really serving no function. So what's the purpose of keeping that layer? Is just wasting space. Another thing is cleaning up. Why would I need to clutter my layers view here with additional layers that really serve no purpose? So in this case, that's something that I can do. Now, there's one reason why I might want to keep for a little bit the previous layer is in case I apply the Viveza layer and something went off and maybe the changes that I made aren't something that I want to keep, or perhaps it was way too aggressive. In that case, I can potentially get rid of this layer, go back to my previous layer, and then work with it. But at this point, I'm not really worried because I really like what I've done here with the background. So this becomes my kind of top layer on top of everything else here. So let's do now a few other changes to the image. What I'd like to do here is I really like these clouds and they're really nicely separated from the sky and these lines are just gorgeous. So why not fire up another Viveza? And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work purely on the clouds. So go ahead and maximize that. And we're going to add a control point right here in the clouds. And another thing I want to try is see if I can boost this area just a little bit, maybe add a little bit more color so that we have a little bit more punch compared to the foreground. So one of the things that I really like about this image is how the foreground and the brightness on the top left side of the frame are balancing each other out. So I want to build up something here where it's going to be competing directly with this side of the frame. And I think that's going to work out pretty well. Let's just give it a try. But at least if that doesn't work, I want to be able to bring out more attention to these clouds. And I can do that by a couple of easy tweaks. If I add a control point here just on the cloud, I can work on this setting called structure. And what structure does, it's similar to clarity in Lightroom, but it's a little bit more aggressive toward local adjustments like here in the clouds. Because what it will try to do is it will try to take the edges of the clouds and try to not sharpen them, but bring them out a little bit more. So it increases contrast locally wherever I apply this. And as you will see, watch this, as I increase the structure at a high level, if we take a look at what it does to the clouds, and I can move this around, if we go ahead and turn that off and turn it back on, look at that drastic change. Now this is something that I set to 100%, and that is way too much. I usually never go to something like 100% because it does increase the opportunity for things like halos, which I cannot really stand. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tone this down to a much lower value. So maybe start with something like 30 at the most, maybe 25. And again, if we go back and undo and redo, you can see that it's darkening the cloud, but it's also separating those lines that we see here, these beautiful, beautiful rays. So I'm going to keep it right around there and maybe add just a little bit of warmth, just so that I can separate that out. And I'm not going to do anything crazy, just a little bit. All right, so let's reduce that size because I do not want that to influence anything else potentially. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that and place that pointer in a number of locations in the clouds where I want to highlight that. And as you can see, I'm spacing them out roughly in the same distance where that outer circle is touching each of these points. And I found that to work fairly well for a lot of images. Once you start overlapping them too much, it can lead to some trouble. So in this case, I don't think I'm gonna have any issues. So maybe add a little bit of pop to the cloud right here. And here, maybe just because it's white, I might want to actually increase that structure a little bit more just so that I can separate that out. So maybe right around 40. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. Maybe work on these clouds just a little bit. And I'm gonna do the same thing, just bring that pop right here to a very local area. And here what I'm working on is I'm just trying to isolate these clouds from the background so that they stand out and look really, really pretty. All right, so that should do it. Let's go ahead and turn that off, turn it back on. As you can see, I was able to highlight the clouds and separate them out from the background very nicely. And this works really well when you have patchy clouds. All right, so now that I've done it, I think I'm going to try to work on this area a little bit. So I'm going to add another control point, and this one is going to be to this yellow area. Let's just see what happens if I start applying more saturation to this area right here. Now keep in mind, when I do this, although this control point is larger and it's actually crossing with these, since this is a different area of color, it should not be affecting the colors of the clouds here. But you gotta watch it out because sometimes it may happen, especially if the color palette is going to be fairly close. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of saturation here. and see what happens. And again, this is something that you can quickly go overboard with, and as you can see, that looks pretty terrible. And unfortunately, there's really no way for me to see what's going on with all these blown out areas right here. So what I'm gonna have to work with is just this slider, and I'm gonna tone it down all the way to maybe somewhere around 10, 11. Because if I go overboard, it's just going to look ugly. Now, in some cases where you have really beautiful clouds and they're lit with red color, what you could do is you could use this exact tool to drop the point right on a red cloud and make it even more red. You gotta be careful as you work with this though, because in this particular case, since I have this yellow patch of color, I cannot be adding the red color. It will look really funky. With yellow and red getting mixed up, you're gonna see all kinds of weird stuff like that. So I am not going to touch that red slider. You gotta be very, very careful about how you use it. So let's take a look at before and after. And that looks pretty good. I think that slight boost of yellow right here in the center is looking pretty good. And again, the change is very subtle, but it's definitely there. Now, what I want to do is I was able to separate these lines on the top with the blue, but this area doesn't have that. So I'm gonna go ahead and add another control point right here to the edge of the frame, just focusing right here. And I'm gonna add it a bit more structure. And look what happens as I push that. As I push that towards the right side, and it's doing this really crazy separation, which can be pretty bad in this case because then it's starting to affect the color. So I have to be very careful with that structure and bring it down maybe to a smaller value, but enough to be able to separate that out from the sky. So one more time, let's take a look. Preview, off, and on, and look at that. All right, so I think that's really good, and we can just go ahead and click OK. And right now I have another layer that's getting prepared to be applied on top of the previous layer. So now I have two vivezes. We've got the second one that I just applied, and as you can see, the changes in the clouds are pretty significant, and I only worked on the clouds. And then the second layer is again something that we really do not need. So I can just completely trash that and get rid of it. So at this stage of the game, my image is ready. I'm satisfied with the changes that I made. I was able to bring this image to a completely different look by adjusting contrast, local contrast, by using these different plugins to be able to add that additional pop to the clouds. I dodged and burned, did the spot healing earlier. All kinds of changes have been already applied, and I'm really happy with these results. So the next thing that I'm going to do is apply sharpening. Now, sharpening is something that I typically leave for the end. So in this case, a lot of people might be wondering, well, why can't you do that earlier? Because if you add sharpening earlier, then if you're making other changes on top of them, then you might be adding unnecessary noise. And sharpening is something that you want to be very careful about. So I always add it at the very end because then I can go back, undo the sharpening settings, and restart depending on what type of image I need. If I'm doing this for print, I might be a little bit more aggressive on sharpening. If I'm doing this for web, I might tone that down a little bit. So I want to keep that as the last layer. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Now, if you are wondering about the sharpening techniques, there are so many different ways to do this. And there are ways to do it through all kinds of filters. In fact, right here in the Google's Nik suite alone, there are two ways to sharpen images. Then on top of that, you can use the regular filters like Smart Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and then you can also duplicate the layer and create a high pass filter and do all kinds of other stuff to yield pretty much the same result. In this case, what I want to do is I want to apply Smart Sharpening. And I'm not talking about the filter Smart Sharpen, but the concept of applying sharpening to localized areas. Because at the end of the day, when you apply sharpening, what it does is it enhances the edge contrast and makes some things appear sharper and more detailed, but by doing that, you might be hurting other areas of the image. In this case, the sky is very beautiful, and if I add sharpening to the sky, it might add unnecessary noise. By using a sharpening technique where you're localizing sharpening and saying, I only want to apply it to specific areas, then you are avoiding the potential for damaging the other areas of the image. So let's go ahead and do that. And like I said, there are many ways to do this. I'm just going to use a very simplistic method. I'm going to go ahead and go to Filter, and again, Nik Collection, And the reason why I love these tools, there are two ways here to do it, the output sharpener and the raw pre-sharpener. Now we kind of did pre-sharpening in Lightroom already a little bit, but here we're doing localized ones. So we can still apply more sharpening on top of it, and I'll show you how that works. But if you use the output sharpener tool, you have additional controls like adding more structure to the image, adding more contrast to the image. Since I'm already done with all of that, I don't have to worry about it. So I'm just going to fire up the raw pre-sharpener. Now when this comes up, you're going to have a few different options here. This looks similar to Viveza in terms of the different controls you've got. You've got the loop right here, which you can move to different areas of the image. And as you can see, as I move, that moves together. And if I click on this pin, I can actually set a specific area of interest and click on that area, and it will just stay. And then you'll be able to also move it around just by clicking and dragging in this area right here. But the left side is showing what it looks like before sharpening is applied, and the right side is showing what's the effect of sharpening here. So by default, it's going to use something like 50% adaptive sharpening, and then you have the option to sharpen the areas or sharpen the edges. Now, this middle section right here is where it's set to, and that's usually what I like using, because if you're going to push it towards sharpen areas, you will see a drastic effect. In fact, let me demonstrate how that looks like. If I'm going to go ahead and select the cloud area right here and click on it, look what's going to happen if I'm going to move towards sharpen areas. It's just adding all that crazy grain. And in fact, I haven't really seen images where this particular setting, moving it to the left, really works. And if I go to the opposite side, just sharpening edges, it doesn't sharpen any of the detail, but it's going to pick areas. So if I go ahead and click now here, it's just going to add sharpening to the very edges and not apply more global sharpening. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that back right around to the middle, where it's going to kind of try to find the balance between the two. Another nice thing about this tool is that if you have an image that contains a lot of grain because you were shooting at high ISO, it's smart enough to try to identify those kind of areas that have noise and not apply sharpening around the noise. So if you do have a high ISO image, there is a selection tool right here, which is going to apply slightly different algorithm than normal. Now, in this case, I shot it at base ISO 100, so I don't have to worry about that. I don't have that much noise to deal with. So normal is going to work just fine. Now, the reason why I like this tool is because it has the control to do smart sharpening to certain areas that I want to keep sharpening at, and then I'm able to reduce sharpening or completely remove it from other areas that I do not want to touch. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. With the default setting of 50, if I take a look at these rocks right here, it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. And if I start pushing this more towards the right, it becomes more aggressive in terms of how much sharpening gets applied. So I got to be very careful. If I push it all the way to 100, as you can see, that is a lot of sharpening, and that's something that I don't definitely want to see in my image. But between maybe 40 to 60 is something that can work. In some cases, even toning down to something like 35 will work pretty well. I'm going to go ahead with about 60 because remember, I can go back and change the opacity and reduce this. But by doing this, as you can see, that is actually a lot of sharpening added to the image. And this side looks blurry. This side now shows a lot more contrast, and sharpening is doing a really good job there. So what I'm going to do is right here in the sky, in fact, if I'm going to go ahead and click on the sky area here, as you can see, it is actually adding noise, and that's something I do not want. Look at the clouds here. You've got a lot more noise and no noise here. So what I want to do is completely eliminate the sharpening from the sky area. And if I click on this minus right here and add a control point, what it's going to do is going to say, okay, for everything that this control point is touching, you do not want to add additional level of sharpening. Now, this is also going to be similar to the other tools that we used before, because it's going to also kind of look at the colors and different areas of the image. And if I'm selecting just the sky, hopefully it's not going to touch other areas of the image. So let's go ahead and try that. Now, I applied that to that side of the frame. I'm going to now move that pointer over here. And by doing that, as you can see, it's actually not damaging the image anymore. This is looking really good in here and it's not doing additional sharpening. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So that's the first control point. In fact, instead of adding another one, I'm just going to duplicate it and then switch to this tool and just move this one around. And we're just going to cover that entire sky. And maybe just move over to these blue areas, cover a little bit of the sky and the clouds here. So I'm just duplicating this and hopefully avoiding the potential for adding sharpening to those areas of the sky. So let's take a look now. If I just look and hover the mouse over, as you can see, the left side and the right side are looking pretty much identical. So I don't really have any noise added to those areas. And if I look here, even here where I'm potentially overlapping, as you can see, this one is overlapping the mountains, there's still a little bit of sharpening getting applied to those areas. So this is working really well. I'm gonna go ahead and now click OK. Now that the new layer Sharpener Pro 3 is applied on top of Viveza 3, well, guess what? If I'm going to try to do anything with the bottom layers, nothing is changing, because what it does, unfortunately, takes everything from below and compiles it into yet another layer. So if I were happy with the changes that I had in Viveza and I don't want to do anything with it, at this point, it's pretty safe to get rid of that layer, because everything that we have done so far in Nik Software, or in this case Google Nik, has been merged into this one single layer. So let's take a look at what kind of sharpening we were able to apply. Now if I look right here, there's quite a bit of sharpening added to the foreground and it's looking really nice. And if I start moving towards the background, well, there is a little bit of sharpening added to these areas, and maybe that's not something I want, and I'll show you how I can take care of that, but there's additional sharpening here, and the sky is looking pretty clean. So here's another thing that we can do. What we could say, well, maybe the sharpening that I applied is a bit too aggressive. And maybe I'm not happy with the fact that it's touching these areas right here. Well, remember, what I could do is I could always create a mask and say, well, all the sharpening is okay, except for the areas that I want to mask out. So at this stage of the game, however, I really don't have the layer underneath. So if I start masking it out, what's going to happen, since I don't have the previous layer, is just going to start erasing this top layer. So take a look. Go ahead and select the brush, and as I start painting that out, look at what it's doing. It's actually revealing that bottom layer, and all those changes that we made with these new layers are going to be lost. So I really don't want that. So the only way to take care of this is I'm going to go ahead and undo and step back 2, because I want to bring that Viveza 2 back. Because the sharpening that I applied on top of the previous layer, if I go ahead and check and uncheck the setting, as you can see, the bottom layer is the one that doesn't have sharpening applied to it, and the top layer is the one that does. So if you do run into an issue like this, where the localized sharpening doesn't work very well, and you want to tweak additionally and mask out some of the things that you don't want affected, then you do not want to be getting rid of that bottom layer, at least not yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a mask, and this is just going to be a white mask, which means that I would have to use a black brush in order to start erasing parts of the image. So let's say that I'm not happy with this sharpening getting added to this side of the image. What I could do at this point is start to paint them out, and as you can see already, all of that area is getting revealed, and the additional noise that I saw before is now gone. And this is something really cool, because you can do this selectively. And I'm going to reduce the size of the brush, just take it easy in these areas right here, and just paint these very carefully until I get to this area right here. Because again, I don't want any of that stuff on the top touch. So all I have to do is select the tool, and I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of the brush and paint it out. And as you can see, we can already witness a pretty big change in the way that these areas appear. And that's pretty good right there. Let's just paint out the rest of the frame. So let's take a look at our mask. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. If I go ahead and switch to Alt and click there, that is what reveals the mask. And from here, I can say, well, it looks like I didn't finish it up here, so just paint it over any of the areas that I potentially missed. So I can just apply these additional settings here or additional tweaks. And now if we go back to it, the effect here is pretty drastic. Let's take a look at the before and after. So disable, enable, and as you can see, this area is getting sharpening applied to it, but the bottom area right here that I masked out has no sharpening getting applied to it. So another thing that I could do at this point, I could say, well, maybe I'm not happy with these, and also maybe reduce my brush opacity and then just start painting some of these areas out so that the change is subtle. But in this case, I'm really not going to bother with it because that's actually not bad. And if at any point of time you find that the sky was affected somehow, again, all you have to do is paint it out. So in this case, if I increase the size of the brush, make it black, and go ahead and click on the mask itself, I can just completely paint out all of that area right there. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that at this point, I'm using a pretty aggressive opacity of 100%. And what it's doing is any area that is going to have a separation, like for example here, if I zoom in, I might see that this area right here is really, really nice, but the noise is not properly getting transformed from this area to this area. If I wanted to have better results, what I could do is I could, instead of using this black brush, as you can see, that's our mask, which is a pretty dark one. Instead of using that one, I can actually reduce the opacity to say 50% and then just apply very subtle changes on top of the layer before. And if I look at the mask, as you can see, this looks more grayish than black. That means I am reducing it, but not 100% with the black mask. So this is really cool because at this point, I can then just say, all right, well, I'm pretty happy with the results. I was able to apply sharpening to selective areas. I was able to remove sharpening from the areas that I do not want sharpened. And this localized sharpening is going to work really well. So at this stage of the game, if I'm happy with what I've got and the sharpening looks good, what I could do is I could potentially merge the sharpening layer with the previous Viveza layer. And I can do that by simply hitting Control or Command E. And if I do that, both of those layers are now part of a single layer. Keep in mind that if I save the image now, there would be no way for me to go back to edit any of the sharpening settings that I've made before. And if I'm not happy with anything sharpening related, there's no way for me to undo that. So typically, I don't remove that last layer and I keep it for that reason. So I'm going to undo that and bring this back and just save the image at this point because I am happy with everything I've got. So go ahead and hit Control or Command S and the image is now getting saved. Now keep another thing in mind, by adding and keeping that last layer, I am going to increase the size of the file. So at this point, it's trying to save the image. It's about 625 megabytes in size, and that's a lot. I mean, initially it started out at around 40 megabytes or so of raw data, and at this point, it is more than 10 times larger. So you gotta be very careful if you start editing images a lot in Photoshop and you have all these different layers, you might end up with these massive files that are occupying a lot of space. And if you do find that, sure, you could go and flatten the image, and that is by just going to Layer and then Flatten Image, which takes everything and compiles it into a single background layer like that. If I save this image now, it's only going to be 138 megabytes in size, but by doing that, I lose the ability to be able to go back and make changes to it. So I'm gonna go ahead and undo that. And like I said, at this point, I've got all these layers. I can undo the Sharpener Pro settings and all the changes that I made to sharpening by coming back to the image in the future. And if I'm not happy with any of the color or contrast changes, all I have to do is start over, delete these 2 layers, and use these existing 3 layers that I already built up to add any other adjustments that I'm interested in. All right, so we're good with this image and I already saved it. So let's go ahead and close out of it. And actually, before I do that, let's go ahead and go back to Lightroom, and I'm gonna switch to Lightroom. And if I go back to the grid, you will see that we now have two images. So this is the TIFF file, and this is something that Photoshop saved the image as for me to be able to go back to. So in this case, now I have these three edits. I've got that raw file that we worked with, which was a copy of this original file. And now this TIFF file is the image that was brought into Lightroom by Photoshop. And that's the nice thing about the integration capabilities of the two. As long as you don't close out of Lightroom, whenever you save something in Photoshop and it was open from Lightroom, it's going to save it back and import into Lightroom. So anyway, I'm gonna switch back to Photoshop. Let's go ahead and close out of it. I made some changes earlier, so I don't wanna save because it's already saved. I'm good with the changes, and let's take a look at the before and after. So I'm gonna go ahead and select both of these images, and I can either press the N button and that will show me these two images, or I could go into each individual image and press the left and right arrow key to toggle between the two images to see what we've got. I'm gonna hit tab to close the sidebars, and now we've got, this is the after, this is the before, and the image is looking drastically different. So we took it from this bland looking image, which already kind of looked okay from Lightroom, and this is not even where we started. If we actually look at the very beginning, which I'll do in a second, you'll see that the change is drastic. This is just to show you what happened from the moment we finished editing the image in Lightroom to the moment we carried it over to Photoshop, made all the changes to the image and saved it. So this is looking really, really nice, and I'm really happy with the results. So let's go ahead and now go back to the grid, and I'm going to go ahead and compare it to the first image, which is where we started. And same thing, press N and look at what we've got. This is the after, this is the before. This looks completely bland. It might initially look like something that you might never even work with just because you don't see any colors here on the top. All of this looks slightly overexposed in these areas right here specifically, and this looks pretty dark, but look at the difference here. I was able to bring so much detail out of this one raw image that the image on the left side now looks pretty incredible. So let's go ahead and now summarize what we've done to the image. First, we started out with a pretty bland looking image. We were able to make adjustments to it in Lightroom so that it already looks pretty good. And then we took it from Lightroom into Photoshop. And that's where we made most of the changes. And that's something that you have to keep in mind as you work through images. Can you do these kind of things in Lightroom or not? I personally find that Lightroom can be limiting. Now, there are lots of different things that you can do to images in Lightroom. For sure, I could have done many of these changes that I've had in Photoshop performed similarly in Lightroom. However, with all these brush strokes and these local adjustments, local sharpening and dodging and burning, all these different things that I did to the image, it would have taken me longer to do this in Lightroom, and the results wouldn't have been exactly the same. Photoshop is a very versatile tool. As we said before, the sky is the limit. So if you start using plugins, filters, different adjustments, layers, and you start building up on top of each other, you can pretty drastically change the look and feel of the image. And that was just showing you some of the tools that I use. There are many other tools out there that I use every once in a while that might make image even look better. But for this tutorial in particular, I wanted to focus on most of the tools that work for me 90% of the time. So keep this in mind as you work with Lightroom, as you work with Photoshop. There might be things that you're able to do in Lightroom very quickly, but there will be limitations, and specific limitations, as I pointed out, like removing the car from the image, removing all those roads that were in the background scene. All those things are nearly impossible in Lightroom. So keep this in mind. As you take more and more pictures, you might realize that Lightroom has its own set of limitations, and perhaps it's a good opportunity right now for you to explore other editing options like Photoshop. Hopefully, by watching some of the techniques that I utilize on a day-to-day basis, you can take these and apply to your photographs and take them to the next level.